Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 34th chapter in the book of Ezekiel. And in this chapter, he continues much of what he proclaimed in the 22nd chapter, whereby he indicts the sins of Judah and Israel respectively. And in between the respective indictments, he speaks of the furnace of affliction, in other words, the remedial qualities that they had invited upon themselves for their repeated and egregious covenant violations. But in the 34th chapter, he speaks of future ramifications and lays the charge for the national waywardness on the shepherds, who are likened to leaders, be they ecclesiastical or secular. And so much rises and falls upon leadership, and shepherd would have been a relatable analogy to the agriculturally rooted Israeli people, and that they are to care for the sheep and protect them and nourish them and to protect them from danger and everything else. So that being said, we're going to open with the opening verse, which reads, "And the word of Yahweh came to me, saying," so these words are not his own, but they are directly derived from divinity, and this forms the preface of many of the chapters in Ezekiel's book and sporadically at intersections of many chapters. So Ezekiel was a prophet, meaning that he was an inspired messenger of Elohim. "Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, Thus said the Master Yahweh to the shepherds, Woe to the shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding themselves. Should not the shepherd feed the flock?" So the duty of the shepherd is not to fleece the flock, but to provide for them. And any shepherd who exploits them by taking from them and giving nothing in return is essentially failing in their duties. And this was very much the fact of life for both Israel and Judah. By the Israel, we can understand it was in equally applicable terms to both kingdoms. Ezekiel was a citizen of Judah who was transplanted in the original wave of exiles to Babylon in 597 BM, before Messiah. "You eat the fat and you put on the wool. You slaughter the fatlings. You do not feed the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, nor have you healed the sick, nor bound up the broken, nor brought back the straying, nor sought what was lost, but you have ruled them with might and harshness." So much of the shepherd's duty tending to the sheep, be it redeeming them medicinally, or sheep are inherently wayward creatures. Without a shepherd, they're prone to wander and get themselves into all sorts of the trouble, hence the necessity of the shepherd to keep them collected in a productive and safe environment. But much of what he says about sheep and their relation to their shepherd can be applied to the humans who the shepherds, be they secular or ecclesiastical, were entrusted to provide and protect for the people who collectively formed their flocks. "And there they were scattered because there was no shepherd, and they became food for all the beasts of the field when they were scattered." So the scattering is a reference to the Babylonian captivity, which he lays even though it was for the nationwide sins, he lays the bulk of the blame at the feet of the leaders who had led them astray and had not protected them from foreign invasions, and their national prosperity and security was completely contingent on their obedience to the covenant. Judah slightly outlasted Israel, which was scattered by Assyria in 722 BM, Judah in 586 BM, largely because the kings of Israel were invariably identified as idolaters, whereas those of Judah, it seemed to be a pattern and a cycle that whenever a reformer would come to the throne, he'd wipe out and tear down the idols and the edifices of worship for these alternate deities of foreign nations that their predecessor had erected, and no sooner than they would die than would their son return to idolatry. "My sheep wandered through all the mountains and on every high hill, and my sheep were scattered all over the face of the earth, and no one was seeking or searching for them." So even after all of this, the shepherds had neglected their duties to tend and care and mind for the sheep who were wandered and scattered. They have sheep themselves have an inherently independent nature, which is prone to wandering, much like humanity is prone to go their own way and do their own thing. And look where they wound up. They were now this has a futuristic connotation because the diaspora of Ezekiel's generation were almost exclusively concentrated in Babylon, whereas the future diaspora, the Jews have since been scattered throughout all the nations. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of Yahweh. So the shepherds who are entrusted to the shepherd's duty need to know what the word of Yahweh is, and because they have not sought it, they cannot find it, but it comes to them through an authoritative source, that being Ezekiel. And the prophets, there's often a dichotomy between the prophets and the priest and the kings, but Ezekiel was both a priest and a prophet. So in the 14th chapter, for instance, we read that his counsel was sought and respected, if not heeded, by the priest. As I live, declares the Master Yahweh, because my flock became a prey, and my flock became food for every beast of the field, from not having a shepherd, and my shepherds did not search for my flock, but the shepherds fed themselves and did not feed my flock. So because they were inattentive to their flocks and their duties to protect and provide for them, they had scattered, and they could care less. They were indifferent to their welfare, and as a result of their lapse and laxity of leadership, they found themselves in the same places as the sheep whom they had led astray, who they were duty-bound and obligated to keep protected and provided for. Therefore, O shepherds, hear the word of Yahweh. Thus said the Master Yahweh, see, I am against the shepherds, and shall require my flock at their hands, and shall make them cease feeding the sheep, and the shepherds shall feed themselves no more. And I shall deliver my flock from their mouths, and they shall no longer be food for them. So the existence of the shepherd necessitated protection from wolves and the other carnivorous animals who sought to feed the sheep, and sheep do carry meat, and they one of the purposes for which they were gathered was to provide meat for human nutrition, but the shepherds had pigged out on their value. They had exploited them and fleeced them for so long, so much so that Yahweh had taken away their responsibility to return them to its rightful owner, and he is very much the good shepherd, as we read of applied to the Son in John 10, 11, and 14. For thus said the Master Yahweh, see, I myself shall search for my sheep, and seek them out. Now, in places such as Deuteronomy 4:29 and somewhere else in Jeremiah, we are instructed to seek Yahweh, and we will find him. The implications being that he is both knowable and wants to be known, but he cannot be known through our artificial or creative inventions. But because humanity had been so estranged from the Torah and the writings and the prophets, he had no choice but to search for them, and his pre-election grace always precedes our choice in finding him. We read of this in John 15:16. As a shepherd seeks out his flock on the day he is among his scattered sheep, so I shall seek out my sheep and deliver them from all the places where they were scattered in a day of cloud, dense cloud. So Yahweh very much has the nature of the true shepherd or the good shepherd, which is to seek and care for their sheep. In Luke 15:9 or somewhere thereabouts, he leaves the 99 who are safe to search out and actively seek the one who is lost. So that's just in his nature. But by this historical juncture, the inverse was true. There was maybe one out of 100 who remained loyal and stayed in place to their rightful fold and flock. So he had to seek out and search for them because they had no way of knowing him or finding him in the absence of his active initiative. as a shepherd, and I shall bring them out from the peoples, and gather them from the lands, and shall bring them to their own land, and I shall feed them on the mountains of Israel, in the valleys, and in the dwellings of all the lands. So once more, this is a futuristic connotation as evidenced by the plurality of lands, and the Israel speaks of the future unification of the splintered kingdoms of Judah and Israel into a united whole that has occurred in 1948, the unification of Israel. And Ezekiel also prophetically alludes to this fact somewhere, I think, in the 47th chapter. He anticipates the day of their eventual unification as an independent sovereignty. Of course, that sovereignty is very fragile. They have the unique situation on the geopolitical map of being surrounded by hostile nations who none of which recognize their sovereign claims, and all of which to various extents seek their extermination. And not only that, but they have the Palestinians in their midst. But we've commented excessively on the contemporary political dynamics, and we're going to return to the source. In good pasture I shall feed them, and their fold shall be on the high mountain of Israel. They shall lie there in good fold, and feed in rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. So there is no place like a sheep, quite like their home, and without the shepherd to lead them and guide them there and keep them there, they are prone to wander into dangerous territories. And the people of Israel, like unto the sheep, could not find their ultimate provision and satisfaction in the foreign lands, whereas the land of milk and honey was a bountiful land and abundant. Not only that, but they were not in a subjugated second-class station in the socioeconomic order as they were when they were scattered amongst the Gentiles. I shall feed my flock and make them lie down, declares the Master Yahweh. So rest and food are two of the pastoral duties of every shepherd. They are to make sure that their sheep are able to rest and feed and flourish. I shall seek out the lost and bring back the strayed, and I shall bind up the broken and strengthen what was sick. But the fat and the strong I shall destroy. I shall feed them with justice. So those who had pigged out, namely the shepherds at the expense of their fleet, cannot escape the judgment, and rightly so. But the languishing in hunger and food deprived and provision deprived sheep he is very much concerned for, and he will return them to their rightful abundance that the shepherds had neglected to administer. And as for you, O my flock, thus said the Master Yahweh, see, I am judging between sheep and sheep, between rams and goats. Now in Matthew 25:32, the Savior makes the distinction of the sheep, who are likened to followers of his own, and the goats, who are destined for judgment. So that parallel is very much intact in the Old Testament, the analogies being parallel. It is not enough for you to have eaten up the good pasture, and the rest of your pasture you trample with your feet, or that you should drink of the clear waters, and the rest you muddy with your feet. This is posed in the form of a question. It is obviously a rhetorical one. There is no answer that could suggest anything other than they had neglected their duties and had exploited the people likened to the sheep, who they are duty-bound to protect and provide for. And as for my flock, they eat what you have trampled with your feet, and they drink what you have muddied with your feet. So because they had exploited the land and the people in it, and had rendered it fit only for them to eat, the sheep or the people would be entitled to feast on what they had pigged out for themselves on. Therefore said the Master Yahweh to them, see, I myself shall judge between the fat and lean sheep. The fat ones are the ones who overindulge on the necessary vitals to live, and the lean ones are the ones who are deprived, namely because the fat ones cared only for their own benefit and neglected to provide that which was in their power to share with the less fortunate sheep among them. Because you have pushed with flank and shoulder, and thrust at all the weak ones with your horns, and scattered them abroad, therefore I shall save my flock, and let them no longer be a prey, and I shall judge between sheep and sheep. So the need to save his flock is necessitated by the fact of their scattering and their previous exploitation by the shepherds, who were under even crueler masters of foreign oppressors, because the neglect and laxity of care that the Israelite leaders had neglected to provide them. They essentially sold them at the mercy of hostile Gentile foreign powers. And I shall raise up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them, and he shall feed them and be their shepherd. Now David was a man who was elevated from the sheep flock to the throne of Israel, and the pre-professional preparation, he wasn't born in royalty. He ascended to the throne. He did not inherit, but was anointed nonetheless. But the David in this verse is not David himself, but his biological descendant, the Messiah, who is also the Good Shepherd. Remember John 10, 11, and 14, and everything around and in between those verses extensively extrapolate on the nature of the Good Shepherd, and I think I did one on that. You can type in Corey Johnston, John 10, 1 through 21, the Good Shepherd, if you're curious for more on that. And I, Yahweh, shall be their Elohim, and my servant David, a prince in their midst. I, Yahweh, have spoken. So what he speaks, what he promises, he will deliver. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but we have the ironclad guarantee that his word is as good as gold. He spoke the universe into existence. He said, let there be light, and all the other items, and it simply came into being. But not everything he speaks will immediately come to pass, but it will eventually. And I shall make a covenant of peace with them, and make evil beasts cease from their land, and they shall dwell safely in the wilderness and sleep in the forest. This also reminds one of Isaiah's prophetic portents to the end times, whereby the food of chain of carnivorous predators the wolf will lie in peace with the sheep, and all the animals which used to eat each other will dwell in safety and harmony and not need each other for food. And I shall make them in the place all around my hill a blessing, and shall cause showers to come down in their seasons. Showers of blessings they are. Now rain, he does make it pour on the just and unjust alike. We read of in Matthew 5:45, but occasionally he does withhold the rain, and it wasn't for a period of 3 years during the early kingdom split of Israel. It wasn't through the vigorous prayers of Elijah that the drought came to pass and the rains finally fell, and it was only as a result of his constant prayer and faithful loyalty. So even the presence of a single strong petitioner can do much good for the many. And the trees of the field shall yield their fruit, and the earth yield her increase, and they shall be safe in their lands, and they shall know that I am Yahweh, when I have broken the bars of their yoke, and I shall deliver them from the hand of those who enslave them. So this reminds us of the prefacing to the Decalogue. Before he expounds on the 10 Commandments, he reminds them of his power in accomplishing their deliverance from slavery. It was the Egyptians in the Exodus generation, and the Jews have experienced the oppression of more than one foreign power throughout their history, but that will all eternally eradicate one day, and they will know that he is Yahweh when he delivers them finally, permanently, and eternally. And they shall no longer be a prey for the Gentiles, and the beast of the earth shall not devour them, and they shall dwell safely, with no one to make them afraid. So not only will peaceful coexistence exist between the carnivorous predators and their former prey, but also the Jews and the Gentiles, who the majority of their history is defined by acrimony, mutual acrimony, but the walls and bridges began to break down and be built respectively with the formation of the assembly, which welcomes Jews and Gentiles alike, and that is a prelude to the harmony which by right ought to exist not only between Jews and Gentiles, but with all humanity. And I shall raise up for them a planting place of name, and they shall no longer be consumed by hunger in the land, nor bear the shame of the Gentiles any more. So this is the promise which they can bask in hope for, that they will no longer be subjected to the mercies of stronger nations who overwhelm and overpower them and enslave them and oppress them. And that is certainly a promise which would have resounded powerfully to the Jews in the exile generation, which Ezekiel, along with Daniel, was the main prophet of. And they shall know that I, Yahweh, their Elohim, am with them, and that they, the house of Israel, are my people, declares the Master Yahweh. So the Jews in the exile or in slavery had cause to question whether Elohim cared for them anymore, but his care and love and mercy are eternal, and that does not diminish in spite of the circumstances which may compel us to the incipient conclusion that he is other than he is, because his nature is eternal and immutable. So he is as caring and concerned for our welfare and prosperity in as much as he is in adversity. And you, my flock, the flock of my pastor, are men, and I am your Elohim, declares the Master Yahweh. So that concludes the 34th chapter. There's not really a whole lot to say. It's a mostly self-evident statement on that. The Israel is his sheep, and he is their shepherd, and as such, he is concerned with their welfare and provides and protects them, and no foreign power or any other power, satanic or otherwise, can come between them and him at the final day, and that is something to look forward to. And that's all the time we have for today. I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned till next time. See you then. Bye-bye.